Welcome to my Introduction to Theater class for Mississippi State University. This is Dr. Jessica Rogers. She is a PhD graduate of the University of Oregon, and as a little bit of an introduction, she is a theater historian, designer, director, performer, multiple graduate degrees. And as full disclosure, Dr. Rogers and I go back to graduate school. We were in graduate school together and have also collaborated on many productions where I was a director and she was a designer. So welcome and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for letting me talk about something that I can go on and on and on and on about.
Just as a reminder to my class, they are reading Aphra Behn's Emperor of the Moon. And part of their assignment is to read the original text of the play, as well as to read the adaptation which you wrote. As well as we're going to have a discussion about.
Okay, sorry, the audio just keeps coming in and out. It's weird.
Yeah, I'm hearing scratching on my end, so.
Yeah. Sorry, guys, technical issues.
We're trying our best. So.
I'm in Oregon right now, so this is really the only way to do this.
Yeah, it is. And I'm in Memphis, and they're in Mississippi or elsewhere. So, first, I would like to ask you to talk about the characteristics of the play, and we're going to focus on 3 different areas. And so, you could just discuss Emperor of the Moon as a restoration play and what characteristics it has that represents the nature of a restoration play.
Well, I need to ask you a question first. Okay. And how much history does everybody have with regard to restoration stuff? Because everything is kind of connected.
We spent some time going through 17th century history prior to the interregnum. I did a timeline for the students, the nature of the interregnum, and then the restoration afterwards, explaining how monarchy was restored, and in coming back from France, we have a complete change in the nature of because of conservatism that was present during Cromwell's years in the interregnum is now starting to move to the side, which is why plays are going to be written differently, and then women are coming to the stage. So they have a beginning understanding or knowledge of presentation.
Okay. So it sounds like you have a pretty good background, so I'm just going to give a really short recap because we have what's called the Puritan Complaint that was starting to gain popularity actually in the Elizabethan times, so that's during Shakespeare. The Puritan Complaint, they are the extreme left wing of the Presbyterian Church in England, and they're rising in political power through Elizabeth's reign, through James I's reign, through the reign of Charles I, until about 1649 when they decide that, no, we're going to overthrow the government and cut off the king's head, which they do. This, of course, sends everybody into a panic. Most of the royalists, as they were called, flee to the continent from England, so they're going to France, Italy, Spain, and the Puritans pretty much take over political control of England for about 20 years, during which time they are, of course, outlawing fun things like theater, Christmas, and pie. Yes, pie. Eventually, the British people kind of get a little bit tired of this super moral attitude towards fun things, and they encourage the Puritans to leave. Fun fact, the Pilgrims coming over the Mayflower, when they set sail in 1632, these were the guys that left England not so much to escape religious persecution as they thought that the Puritans, yes, again, the ones who outlawed pie, were too liberal. And so they decided that they wanted to have more control over their rules. So they're the ones that left England or were casually encouraged to go. Because again, if you're outlawing pie and considered too liberal, that just should present some idea of where the pilgrims were coming from on the Mayflower. In any case, so in 1660, Charles II, who was the son of the beheaded Charles I, returns from France, where, when he was in exile, he happened to see girls on stage. Please keep in mind that women had been performing in theater for about 100 to maybe 150 years prior to this on the continent. In England, it was still considered really scandalous, again, largely due to the rise of the Puritan influence. In fact, there was a Commedia dell'arte troupe that did travel to Europe, to England, during Elizabeth's reign, and was in fact satirized in Ben Jonson's play Volpone as the, quote, troupe of tumbling whores, because they had women performing, and that was just scandalous, and the English at the time couldn't handle it. But Charles really liked the ladies, and so when he comes back to the throne, as my own personal theory goes, what followed this, the Puritan Commonwealth, was this period of extreme sexual liberation. Basically, people kind of went nuts a little bit. And so suddenly all these repressed attitudes towards sex, sexuality, women, kind of went out the door in a really big way. So the majority of Restoration plays that are coming out of this time are really focused on sex, which is kind of funny if you think about it. In fact, when the theaters were reopened in 1660, Charles II gave charters to only 2 theater companies, one run by William Davenport, the other by Thomas Killigrew. And it's explicitly stated in those charters that women had to play women's roles. So, of course, you guys should all be familiar with the whole Shakespearean notion that all the boys played the teenage girls' roles. Well, suddenly, this not only opens the door for women on stage, it closes the door for men playing women's roles, so they had to find something else to do. It also was kind of the impetus for encouraging something called the breeches role in a lot of Restoration comedies, which is basically the part where some young female thing decides she wants to fool her lover in some way and dresses up like a man, which is not really much of a disguise, frankly, but was in fact really the means for the actress playing this ingenue role to display her legs and ankles to pretty much everybody, and that was considered very titillating and scandalous and giggle-worthy.
And I did give them a brief definition about breeches roles, so thank you for expanding on that.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that's actually going on in Restoration theater. It's a pretty dense topic. So a lot of this is influenced out of, like I said, Charles II's experiences with theater and performance while he was in the continent, most of that which was actually based on Commedia dell'arte. This is all connected. And again, coming from the fact that Commedia had a lot of women's roles, Emperor is actually kind of unique as a Restoration play because it doesn't have the really, really overt sex comedy and sexual farce that a lot of Restoration comedies do. For example, if you ever encounter William Wycherley's play The Country Wife,
I showed them a clip in class of the China scene.
Yes, the China, that's all double entendre. And literally the entire point of that play is you have the hero, Horner, basically feigning impotence as a means of sleeping with all of his friends' wives. And that's the whole point. And that's actually the whole point of a lot of Restoration plays, of how many wives and fiancés can the hero sleep with. There is a lot of sexual assault that happens in these plays as well. In fact, Aphra Behn's most popular play, which was The Rover, it was written in 1677, has a couple of attempted rape scenes and sexual assault scenes that a lot of contemporary audiences find highly problematic. for obvious reasons. But again, it was a way of objectifying the female body on stage in ways that couldn't have been done previously. So for good or for ill, that's why the assault, and that's why that's the kind of the direction that a lot of Restoration playwrights took their plays. To be fair, some Restoration dramas, the assaults actually aren't on stage, but rather off stage, which then gives the actress involved the opportunity to come running back on stage in some sort of state of disarray, which is also somewhat titillating to the Restoration audiences. If you find this problematic, you probably should, because it is. It's highly problematic. However, when Emperor of the Moon was written in 1689, but that was when it was published, Charles II was very ill. And he, as a fan of Commedia, had actually more or less commissioned this play from Aphra Behn. And so she wrote it as a way to please the king, because, you know, it's good to be the king. And he actually died before this play was ever performed. So it's kind of indicative of a little bit of a transition from the pure Restoration of everything is about sex all the time to a more subdued ideology that was happening under James II, who I believe was the one after Charles II. I get a little bit fuzzy on my monarchy. Sorry, guys. And then eventually we have the more conservative swing from the extreme end of the Restoration back towards a little bit more conservative, until it again peaks during the Victorian era, where everything is about God, sex, or death. And if it's about sex, it's highly repressed. But it's still there. So in any case, yes, this play is it is a Restoration play because it is building on the popularity of Commedia that Charles II was bringing over, and in fact, it is an English adaptation of a French play by a female French playwright who went by the name Nolande du Fatouville. And again, please forgive my pronunciation. My French is atrocious. I'm going to say that right now.
I wouldn't have even tried that.
But it's based on her play called L'Harlequin Empereur dans la Lune, which is basically the Harlequin Emperor from the moon. And what Aphra Behn did, because again, there was no such thing as copyright law then, was she borrowed de Fatouville's play and Englished it up, because as we all know, the English are far superior to the French. Although if you talk to the French, they are far superior to the English. They have this thing back and forth, historically speaking. So she did turn it into kind of a farce and a satire, but it is a lot tamer, more tame, I should say, example of a Restoration comedy than other Restoration comedies, because as you all know, because you've all read the play, I'm sure, there isn't the sex element quite as overtly in this play. A lot of it is more innuendo or implied than anything else. So that is Emperor of the Moon as a Restoration comedy.
On that topic, the idea of Scaramouche and Harlequin as pimps is used quite often. That term pimp is used quite often. And that term is actually a 17th century term, correct?
It actually dates farther back than that. I mean, Shakespeare was using it as well. But also, the big thing to keep in mind is that language evolves over time, and so words can have different meaning than what we associate with them now. One of my favorites is actually the word slut. And of course, we're all familiar with the contemporary definition, which is basically a loose woman or somebody who sleeps around. Whereas in 17th century and earlier terms, a slut was actually a woman who was slovenly and unclean, more than somebody who was promiscuous.
Now, taking a look at the play, what characteristics exemplify it as a farce?
Okay, so Emperor is it's a farce because of the entrances and exits, for one. That is one of the more defining features, particularly of stage farces, where you have characters entering as others are exiting, and vice versa. And so it's this constant in and out motion of like missed connections and missed things. In the play, the biggest one is the I renumbered the scenes in my adaptation from the original. So Act 1, Scene 3, where it's the lovers, and they're one is hiding in the closet and not hiding in the closet, and the leathers, and with Harlequin's hiding under the table, Bellamonte's table. That would be the most farcical scene in Emperor, because of all the entrance and the exits, and because there's the mistaken identity, and people are coming in and out, and everybody is confused, and there's just a lot of activity going on in that scene. So that's
other scenes where you have Harlequin and Scaramouche taking on other characters, either pretending to be a pregnant woman, the apothecary, the farmer, not recognizing each other.
Yeah, so has a lot to do with disguise. Behn actually wrote this play. It's a satire, as well as a farce, which I think is an interesting dimension to this, because it can be looked at as a commentary as well on a lot of things that were happening in the popular culture of her time. And she's kind of getting little digs into just how women are treated, I think. Some people use the term proto-feminist after some thought and a lot of reading. I've come to the conclusion that I think that that's a little bit of a misnomer. Just because feminism wasn't actually labeled as an ism until the mid to late 19th century doesn't mean it didn't actually exist. So, I mean, she was absolutely a feminist. One of the things that makes this play, I think, so funny is the dig she makes at the Royal Society, which is England's premier scientific research institution. It was actually another thing that was chartered by Charles II in 1660. And of course, no women were allowed. You couldn't join if you were female. There was actually another female playwright. Her name was Margaret Cavendish. She was the Duchess of Newcastle, who got into some pretty famous arguments with some of the membership of the Royal Society, and also had issue with the fact that they wouldn't let women join. Although she was, in fact, the first woman that they let observe some of the activity and experiments going on, she still wasn't allowed to participate in being an observer. And such, one of the sections that I quite enjoy in Emperor is Act 1, Scene 2. Particularly it says, enter doctor with all manner of mathematical instruments hanging at his girdle, meaning belt. Scaramouche bearing a telescope 20 or more feet long. Well, that's a little bit of a phallic imagery there on Aphra Behn's part, where she is taking the dig at these men who don't necessarily know what they're doing with what they got. And, in a case of mine is bigger than yours, a 20-foot long telescope suggests that Baliardo may be compensating for something.
Right. And it's something I read as I was doing some research and preparing for class, was that if you take the dedication that Aphra Behn wrote and the prologue, that they truly need to be read in tandem with each other. And I would even go so far as to say the epilogue. Take the dedication, the prologue, the epilogue, read those three together in tandem, separate almost from the rest of the content of the play. And you can see that satire quality coming out, her commentary on the men of the time, royal life, scientific community. So I completely understand that.
And it's also commentary on the limitations on women. When I teach Aphra Behn in my own classes, or have done in the past, pardon my language, but I usually refer to her as one of the baddest bitches you have never heard about, because she was an amazing woman. She spied for the English against the Dutch in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. That's actually indirectly how she ended up as a playwright, because as a spy, she was in Antwerp, Belgium, and ended up getting stranded there because the king stopped paying her, basically, and so she ran out of money. And so she didn't have any money to get back to England. She ended up borrowing some. Turns out she was really good friends with none other than Thomas Killigrew, who not only got her into the spycraft, but since he was one of two people, as I mentioned before, with charters to theater, he was kind of like, hey, kind of come into this field then. And so she started writing, and as a result, she's recognized as the first professional English female playwright, because she has a quote from one of the prologues and the epistle dedicatories for The Lucky Chance, where she writes for her bread and is not ashamed to own it, meaning she writes for a living and that's what she does, and she has no shame. And she basically goes on to say that people who think that it's wrong for a woman to do this kind of thing, suck it, because my plays sell really well. She was actually the most produced playwright between 1670 and 1690, I believe, surpassing even Thomas Dryden, who's actually the most produced playwright of the late 17th century. But he's looking at a 40-year span where she's really only looking at 20 years, but she's immensely popular. Nobody ever knows who she was. She, in addition to writing plays, she arguably wrote one of the first novels. It's a story called Orinoco, or the Royal Slave, which is also arguably anti-slavery and anti-colonialism, which again is relatively unheard of back in the 17th century. And that story is more or less based on her own experiences in Suriname, South America, where her father was stationed for a period as a lieutenant governor. So, in a period where going 50 miles outside of the place you were born was a pretty BFD, for her to travel literally halfway around the world was incredible. Her play, The Widow Ranter, is the very first English language play that is set in the New World. It is in fact set in the Virginia colonies. Nobody ever knows about that play. It's not great, but it's still interesting because it's the first play set in the New World. She was also a poet. If you guys really want a good laugh, I highly recommend you read some of the poetry of Rochester, John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester.
Yes, we talked about the Earl of Rochester in class, and I posted within my notes one of his poems, which they refused to read and said I had to read aloud to them during lecture. So,
did you?
Yes, I did. I read it. So.
Which one?
The St. James Park.
Ramble in St. James. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
if I remember correctly, it was that one.
Yep. Yeah. So Rochester, his poetry, as kind of an aside, spawned the entire branch of impotence poems, which is also hilarious if you think about it. But Rochester wrote a poem called The Imperfect Enjoyment, basically all about where the narrator is with his mistress and prematurely ejaculates, and he's really upset about it. And so Aphra Behn actually wrote a companion poem to that, or a response poem to that, called The Disappointment, which is from the female perspective. And it's the type of poem is called a mock pastoral. But she wrote the response to The Imperfect Enjoyment, called The Disappointment, where the woman is with her lover who prematurely ejaculates. And you guys can make any inferences you'd like from there. But, she wrote those kinds of poems. She also wrote the translation of another French piece called The Discovery of New Worlds. I don't know how much of just scientific history you guys are aware of, but basically Galileo invented the telescope in 1609. So, we're talking a little bit earlier in the century. But suddenly he turned this thing that sailors had been using for years up to the sky, and people could map the moon and see the heavens in ways that had never been seen before. Hence the significance of Baliardo being obsessed with people on the moon, and it basically spawned this kind of lunacy. And I mean that in the literal sense, where people were suddenly crazy about the moon, and all kinds of stories were being written about people who have claimed to have been to the moon. In fact, the first scene of Act 1, a lot between Ilaria and Scaramouche, they're listing all these different kinds of books, which during the time weren't actually written as fiction. As fiction as a genre didn't really exist then. It was considered too subversive and possibly harmful for women to read this kind of thing because they might think it's real. So again, another thing that Aphra Behn is definitely blasting and satirizing is the fact that it's Baliardo and a man who's reading all this stuff and thinking it's real.
Speaking of Baliardo and the fact that he is a doctor, he is definitely an example of Il Dottore in Commedia dell'arte.
Yes.
What characteristics do you see then? And you've already mentioned that she wrote this as an example of Commedia dell'arte. What characteristics within Emperor of the Moon do you see that this is a Commedia dell'arte play?
Well, first of all, most of the names are direct references to Commedia characters. Baliardo, as you mentioned, is Il Dottore, or the doctor character, who's basically, he's not a medical doctor. He's the PhD kind of scholarly doctor. The name itself, Baliardo, translates into great liar, or great deceiver, something to that effect. And so in the Commedia tradition, Il Dottore is one of the maestro, is pretty much a blowhard who thinks he knows it all but really doesn't know anything. And that's more of a commentary on the academy with a capital A as an institution and just higher learning in general, because again, people have always been slightly suspicious of people who know other things, and there are all kinds of stereotypes, and Baliardo was falling into it. He has the in Commedia dell'arte, he has the Emilia Romana dialect because of the University of Bologna, which is actually the oldest university still in operation in the world. It predates Oxford by, I think, a few decades. As the second oldest, Oxford is the second oldest university. And so the character, he's pompous. He thinks he knows everything, but really knows nothing. He is very gullible in his pretensions. And so this is, like I said, Aphra Behn was directly pulling from Commedia. Her clowns in Emperor are also directly from the Commedia tradition. You have Harlequin, which in Commedia would be Arlecchino, which actually means little devil, because Harlequin is a very mischievous character. Now, again, because Emperor is an English adaptation of a French play based on Italian Commedia.
Partly probably why it is set in Naples, set in Italian.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's also you can look at that as part of the Brecht's Verfremdungs effect, which is kind of a distancing effect. So it's she's attacking the Royal Society in England, but by setting her story in Italy, she's separating.
Yeah. She's giving the distancing.
Right. So she's saying, "Oh, I'm not really commenting on the Royal Academy. Oh no, this is in Italy. Yeah, Italy, over there. But it's really over here," kind of thing. So like I said, Harlequin is directly from the Commedia. Scaramouche is also directly from Commedia. He's one of the Il Capitano from Commedia. And in fact, the name Scaramouche in Italian, Scaramuccia, literally means little skirmish. In Commedia, he likes to fancy himself as a fighter, but is kind of more of a lover and a little bit of a womanizer. The commedia character usually carries around a guitar and serenades people, which is why I have my Scaramouche serenading people, and why they end up having the dance off in my adaptation. And Mopsiphil, her name isn't as directly related, but she is the Columbina character, or Dove, from Commedia, and in fact is one of, if you're looking at intelligence, and I had this discussion with my cast, in fact, we determined that Mopsiphil is in fact the smartest person on that stage.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that.
Which is interesting considering how she's treated in the end. She's very much objectified, given over as the prize between Harlequin and Scaramouche, but she is in fact the smartest person on that stage, followed by Harlequin and Scaramouche, followed by the lovers, with of course Baliardo being the gullible one.
And would you say, from a Commedia standpoint, that we actually have double sets of lovers within this who are playing those Commedia roles?
You do, as the innamorati, or the lovers in Commedia. Commedia lovers, there's humor to them, but they tend to be fairly insipid. And the humor usually comes from that kind of nauseating display of public affection that a lot of lovers have and people make fun of, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that's where the comedy is. But really, in Commedia tradition, the innamorati are kind of there as the romantic foils for the mischief and the comedy of all the other characters. They're kind of the straight men, as it were, to the antics of everybody else. What I think Behn is doing with her Cynthia Ilaria and Charmante Bellomonte is she's taking the lovers. First of all, she gives a little bit of gumption to the girls. They don't passively accept anything. They're kind of like, no, I don't want to do this. We're going to do it my way. And they're quite clever about it. Hopefully, have you shown them the video, the recording of my production?
No, I haven't. I intend to post links to that.
Well, hopefully you get to see it, because the two actors who were playing Ilaria and Bellomonte were simply delightful, absolutely delightful. Especially the gal playing Bellomonte. We decided that the Ilaria Cynthia pairing was really the more romantic one, whereas the Charmante Bellomonte was a little bit more lusty.
Right.
And their comedic timing was simply spot on. I couldn't have been happier with that. And so, we gave them a little bit more of a backbone, and I think Aphra Behn gives them a bit more of a spine than traditional Commedia lovers. But again, the farce aspect, the satire aspect, a lot of her play with the asides, it's kind of direct interaction with the audience. Commedia, as an art form, tends to be highly improvisationally based. And as a result, we don't really have any Commedia plays from prior to Servant of Two Masters, because trying to write down improvisation doesn't really work.
In this play, you can see that the characters are definitely attempting to do improvisation. They get put on the spot, especially Harlequin and Scaramouche, and they're dealing with Baliardo. And so they're making stories up.
Absolutely. They are put on the spot. There's improvisation. And even on the stage, in the stage direction, there's improvisation there. They fall into an antic dance, or they have a ridiculous spite, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of room for silliness. There's also Commedia, being that it's highly based in improv, is something that tends to pull a lot from its surrounding environment and what's happening at that moment in that space. Which is why in the original text, there are so many allusions to pop culture references in the 17th century that don't always quite work in the 21st century. So that was one of the bases for me to do a slightly updated adaptation, only because 17th century stuff wouldn't necessarily make sense to a 21st century audience.
So why did you choose to do an adaptation of this play?
Well, I felt it was really in line with the traditions of commedia. Again, pulling from popular culture, pulling from current events of the time. And so, you know, I kept most of the language and most of the dialogue, except where it didn't make sense. And because I'm a huge nerd, as your instructor will be more than happy to attest, I was also able to kind of do things that made me giggle. For example, when Harlequin and Scaramouche have their dance-off over Mopsville, in the original stage direction, it was something to the effect of they fight ridiculously. And so there's even no, Scaramouche falls to playing. Plays his guitar, and Harlequin falls to dancing. So there's already a dancing moment in the original text. I just took that because rather than have my actor play the guitar, we had a dance-off scenario where they started off with doing the choreography to Michael Jackson's Beat It, and then they broke off into little individual snippets of, we did Hound Dog by Elvis Presley, we did the Hernando's Hideaway, which is the tango, a famous tango piece. We did the chicken dance, which, if you're not familiar, is a da 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 da. Yeah, so you guys all know. We did the chicken dance. We did we started doing the whip and nae-nae, which had to be explained to me because I still don't know what a nae-nae is, quite frankly. We did a little bit of Soulja Boy, I think, is in there. And we ended the whole thing by recreating part of the lift from Dirty Dancing with I've Had the Time of Your Life. Oh, we did Grease Lightning. That was another one we definitely did. The Go Grease Lightning part, because we had to get a little shout out to musical theater in there. But, you know, it worked because it was still kind of a competitive thing. The audience could recognize it as such because of the contemporary music and allusions to things that everybody knows, more or less, or at least is somewhat familiar with, with the exception of possibly the nae-nae. So we did that kind of thing. The scene at Mopsifil's window, when Scaramouche serenades her, we did a little bit of an homage to the 1987 John Hughes Say Anything, where I had Scaramouche show up with an old Victrola.
Yes.
And play kind of a somewhat warped version of Peter Gabriel's In Your Eyes. During the final battle between the Knights of the Sun, the Scaramouche from Huntsville, we turned it into a lightsaber battle. I had a giant screen that we projected the moon onto, and for that scene, we briefly played snippets of the Empire theme from Star Wars and turned the moon into the Death Star. So, you know, little silly things like that, because it's all connected and it was all referencing contemporary pop culture. A lot of it was for my own entertainment, because pretty much everything I do is for my own entertainment to some degree.
You could say that even though it's a 17th century play, it was a commentary using a lot of pop culture. So adapting it today and making use of today's pop culture is it's an appropriate idea to do within that type of an adaptation.
Yeah, and that's partly why we did it, you know, and that's why I let my play be a little bit anachronistic because of that. I felt that there was no need to do, yes, we are going to be a purist here and do a purely historical version. And that didn't make any sense to me. Like I said, because most contemporary audiences, I felt, wouldn't necessarily understand a lot of 17th century references, some of which don't even exist anymore. We only know them because they pop up in various literature, but, you know, whatever it is that they're referencing, a book or a play, it's lost and we don't have it. So
then with your adaptation, which my students have and are supposed to be reading if they haven't read it already.
Brilliant, I tell you.
Starting on page 61, it's after the intermission. It's within Act 3. there is the comparison in the discussion between Baliardo and Harlequin about the roles of men and women on the moon versus the roles of men and women here on Earth. And everything Harlequin says to Baliardo, Baliardo responds with, "Oh, just the same here. Women are the same here," is what you see on the moon. Men are the same here. And in fact, nothing that they're saying is complementary to women and the roles of women, and they tend to be boasting towards men. Um, from a feminist perspective, which is what I've used in class as an ism throughout our discussions all semester long, how do you view that scene? And even though it's in your written adaptation, did you direct it and produce it on stage?
It is pretty misogynistic, which, you know, some people might think is contradictory to a lot of what Ben is doing, but in fact, I think she's playing to expectation, gender roles in this case, and is kind of giving people something to think about by poking at it, so to speak, and by exaggerating it, exaggerating the expectations. I think that it's feminist. It is feminist because, again, she's kind of tongue in cheek saying, "Oh yeah, this is what women are totally like," by using some pretty extreme examples. And while, you know, she's playing to a negative stereotype, I don't think she agrees with it because, again, the women in her play are nothing like that. Ilaria and Mopsiphil and Belamonte are nothing like that. Interestingly, for my adaptation, we had a female Baliardo, who was absolutely brilliant actor, and I thought it actually brought an interesting kind of nuance to the whole conversation, particularly with regard to women as academics, since it wasn't a thing really in the 17th century. Not that it didn't happen per se, but it wasn't recognized as such, and women definitely weren't given the same kind of acknowledgments that men were. And so for my actor Amy Hamilton to have this conversation with the Harlequin character, which we did rehearse but didn't end up using, we ended up cutting it largely because the scene kind of dragged, honestly. So it was less a comment on the misogyny and more just the timing wasn't working with it. And so in that respect, it was a purely directorial choice on my part and not related to theory or criticism, because I enjoyed the tongue-in-cheek nature of it. I enjoyed the just the ridiculous and the pomposity of it. But yeah, timing-wise, it just didn't really seem to fit, and I was trying to shave some time off of my production, and the scene, since it wasn't working, it had to go. Which sometimes that's the way it is. But so, you know, I think that doesn't discredit the scene at all. It's like I said, because I do think, again, Ben is just very tongue-in-cheek with things and using her satire.
Right. And if we keep in mind that that is definitely a satirical section in the larger scope of this entire piece, it gives us a different understanding of what's going on with this play and what Behn is attempting to accomplish.
Well, I mean, you have to look at the whole play as satire because there are little moments everywhere. You know, the very first scene, when Mopsiphil comes running back in to talk to Scaramouche and Ilaria, have just been going on and on about, like, how came Baliardo all these ridiculous boys? Oh, by reading foolish books. Yeah. Kind of thing. Like, look at this. He believes everything he reads. And then Mopsiphil comes running back in and is basically saying, "Hurry, hurry, hurry, my master's coming. Run, my master's conjuring for you like mad below. He calls up all his little devils with hard names, his microscope, his horoscope, his telescope, and all his scopes." So basically, you know, again, that's a satire on all the little instrumentation that he's using, because clearly a horoscope, I mean, it could be a timekeeping thing, but we know it now as the astrological thing. So it's just a manner of looking at, what the sciences were doing at the time, or natural philosophy as it was known.
Okay, so do you think then that within the title, when Aphra Behn calls this a farce, do you think that she's purposely using the word farce to distract from the satirical nature of the play?
I think in part because if she were to call it a satire directed at the men involved with the Royal Society, that probably wouldn't have sold as well. Um, and again, there's still an element of political maneuvering involved in these plays. You can't necessarily shove ideology down an audience's throat any more in the 17th century than you necessarily can today. If somebody were to write a play based on, and to call it, I'm going to call it Once Upon a Time, a true fairy tale based on why everything is horrible and the government is failing the people and the world is slowly crumbling. I don't know how many people necessarily see it, but if I were to call it a farce or a satire or just imply it's a comedy, it's funny, ha ha ha, it is part marketing ploy, and it is a farce. She's not wrong.
It's a bit more palatable to audiences and producers alike.
Right. Again, I think it goes back to that whole idea of distancing an audience from truth a little bit, kind of cushioning the blow, as it were.
That kind of covers the things I wanted to be able to present to the class. I wanted to talk about those characteristics of it being a restoration, a farce, as well as a commedia dell'arte play example. Why you chose to adapt this, as well as talking about some specific scenes. And we also know that this is definitely a commentary on the politics of the times, whether it's royalty, theaters, academia, even looking at the status of men and women, and the opportunity of the ideas of both satire and farce here. Any final thoughts you want to leave with my students regarding either the original, the adaptation, Aphra Behn, or anything we've discussed today?
I think this is actually one of the more approachable restoration plays. I hate using that term, but because it's actually so lacking in the sex and the overt misogyny that is found in so many other restoration plays, like The Country Wife, this is a really fun play to do. For me, I chose it as my doctoral directing project because I saw a lot of parallels between Baliardo believing everything he reads, with people believing everything they read on the internet. It's this whole information exchange and the necessity of critical thinking. I always remind my students that the job of the teacher is not to tell you what to think, but rather how to think. And I think this play is an example in terms of trying to point audiences and public into a hey guys, think for yourself kind of thing. The ending of the play I find equally concerning, where Baliardo basically goes from believing everything to wanting to believe nothing, where he's taking a very absolutist approach, and that isn't, it's not the solution either. He says, burn all my books.
It's very black and white in terms of I'm either going to believe it all or I'm not going to believe it all.
Right. And I think, that's a commentary in and of itself that Ben is kind of slyly pointing out, and that doesn't necessarily have a resolution. The play ends. We don't know what life is like post the Emperor farce, so to speak. Presumably Ilaria marries Cynthio and Bellamonte marries Charmante, and they all go off to their own households, but we don't know what life was like for Baliardo afterwards. So something to keep in mind. But yeah, so I saw a lot of parallels in terms of that kind of absolutist thinking. And like I said, the information overload that was happening in the 17th century with scientific development, I thought was very much akin to the information overload that we have now with the internet. And just as a kind of a fun cautionary of, hey guys, let's think about things first, please. I think I mentioned earlier that the novel wasn't really a literary genre in the 17th century, and because it was considered subversive for women. So a lot of these stories were written in the form of travel narratives. And that's why you'll find a lot of 17th and 18th century books, novels, written as either travel narratives or as epistolary novels, meaning books based on letters, which is kind of a deceptive form to the credible minds, I guess, of the 17th and 18th century, where, if you read a book that's set up like a journal of today I went to the moon and blah, 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 set up as firsthand accounts, they believed it.
Right.
And there were lots of people who believed it. And there were lots of people who were writing these travel narratives and these epistolary accounts of going to the moon, which is why Baliarda believes it. So, again, it's that kind of thing of check your sources, people. Know what it is you're reading, and if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But that was really my impetus for this play, and I think more people should be familiar with it because it's simply fun. Also,
that fun definitely comes across in reading it. I know both versions. I'm laughing. I'm enjoying the play.
I wanted to leave you guys with this.
Back up just a little bit. Can you back it a little bit? It's a little out of focus.
Better or worse?
Well, because your blur is on. There, that's good. jkrogers77@gmail.com.
Yes, so if you have any questions about Restoration Theater, that is in fact my primary area of scholarship, with connected areas in Commedia dell'arte and Renaissance theater. So that is, as a theater historian, that's what I look at. So basically it's Shakespeare through 1800. It's kind of a big span, but I like it. It's fun. Please feel free to email me with any questions you have. If you missed my email, you can get it from your instructor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. I still get used to that. This has been great, and I hope it's been informative and good for my students. So I appreciate your willingness to do this, as well as letting me provide them with the adaptation to read and the videos from the University of Oregon production that you directed. So.
Yes. Fun thing, these plays, they're not in copyright. They're all public domain, so you can do whatever you want with them.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. And so I will stop the recording here. I appreciate it. I hope that this has been informative for everyone in class.
I hope so too.